a real pleasure to be here. I've been several times at the museum before, usually with icon-related things, and it's a really delightful thing that icons continue to change in their meaning and expand in their meaning. Constanza and I met for the first time yesterday, and already I think we've learned from each other so many new things about what icons can mean. And already from your talk, it's just making me think a lot about how museums and institutions have histories and biographies, and just the way a museum treats an icon or treats the idea of icons is in itself a whole story. So I'm going to be treating another sort of part of the history that wraps around icons without actually looking at icons themselves, and thinking about how the interest in icons in a particular country. You've talked about Germany. I'm going to talk about the United States here, right? And the idea that that also has its history. When did Americans first have developed an interest in icons? And I'm going to look particularly at the first 50 years or so, in which icons came into the consciousness of American people, because there was, I would like to argue that there was a beginning point. It's not that Americans have always been interested in icons at all. It had to start somewhere, right? And in each country it would have started under different conditions, and I think this shift of context is really interesting. I also want to say how beautiful it is to be talking down here while up in the mezzanine is the Kushnirskiy exhibition, which is very much about a contemporary attitude towards collecting icons. So what I'm talking about is something from 100 years before that. And just to evoke that idea that collecting itself is something that changes over time. Like, people collect things differently for different reasons at different moments. So this is the origin of my idea of looking through American eyes. And also, maybe this is a little bit hammy to say it's a forgotten history, but like so many things come and go out of fashion. And to me, the history of icons in this country had a great following in the first half of the 20th century, and then it kind of went dormant, and then it came back again. So I'm going to be talking about this kind of early history of the collecting of icons in this country. So I'm going to go back to the 1880s, which is where I think, I could be wrong, but I think I'm right, that this is the very first moment you could see a glimmer in the eye of the collective American citizen, that there are these things called Russian icons, and they might be kind of interesting. And this is a clip from an article in the Philadelphia Times, but it was serialized all across the country. This was like when in the winter of 1889, 1890, suddenly the American press started writing about icons. Where did this come from? And that they would say that this was a typical comment. There are not for sale in this country a dozen of these images, which ever saw the land of the Tsar. Now that's kind of a double-edged sword. It's like, what does that mean? That they were made here, that they're fakes? But I think the really critical thing here is that by the end of the 1880s, there was almost no consciousness of what an icon was. And what I'm showing you here is this image, which is actually from the Berkeley Anthropology Museum, the Phoebe Hearst Museum, one of the very few institutions at the end of the 19th century that was interested in icons from the very specific perspective of the comparative history of religions. And actually the Hearst Museum at Berkeley has a really interesting collection of icons that were formed in the 1890s, early 1900s, from this perspective of the world's religions. That was kind of how it was possible for the American specialist audience to find interest in them. The second quote I wanted to give you, which is from the same article, is how these early icons that Americans came across appeared to the average viewer. So when you read about them in a newspaper article, all but the upper part of the body is represented with a rude conventionality that is not altered by so much as a line in the hands of centuries of carvers. I don't know why they're saying carvers, I think they mean, and it's covered by a gold tinsel screen. And this idea that this is what an icon was, it never changed, it was monotonously the same. It was something astonishing that these Russian Christian people kept doing the same thing over and over again, and they were not subject to change. and that the icons that Americans saw in this period invariably had these slightly flashy, he's using the word tinsel covers on them. So this was like the first experience for an American audience of what a Russian icon was. Now I'm going to show you three reasons. They're not really reasons, it's more sort of like contextual background, why I think the 1880s is when, sort of a critical mass idea, like when does an interest in something start to appear? And I've given you three examples for why I think the 80s was a period where Americans were ready to look at icons in a way they hadn't before. So one is that there was a really tantalizing imagery that began to come into American popular consciousness through painting. And I'm showing you here this amazing, huge history painting that now hangs at Hillwood Museum in Washington, D.C. Some of you may have seen it. In the early 1880s, it was one of the most popular, famous paintings in America. And this is because this guy on the left here, Charles W. Schumann, a German immigrant, a jeweler by trade, he had opened a jewelry store in downtown New York, and he bought this gigantic painting to hang in his jewelry store. He charged 50 cents per visitor to come in and see it because it was so stupendously flashy and exciting, and the viewer it was like a way of getting people in the door into his jewelry store. But there was also like a conceptual, emotional connection to be drawn between these amazing 17th century boyar Russian nobles covered in jewels and pearls, and the jewels and pearls you could buy in Schumann's store. So this is really just like how do ideas begin? This is the beginning of what I think could be called Russomania in the 1880s. It's a verifiable thing, I think. And what I want to particularly focus on here is the right-hand corner, because this Russian painter, Konstantin Makovsky, he specialized in these history paintings of the Russian historical past. And in every one of these paintings, there is an icon corner. So this is in the very top right-hand corner and you can see it's very dim, but its very dimness is what's so exciting about it. In the flickering candlelight, in the lampada, flashing on the metal covers of the icons, here are the precious icons from the historical past. And I think that visual imagery is like one of the things that made it possible to think that icons might actually be rather beautiful to look at, or at least interesting to look at, and not monotonous and covered with a tinsel cover. So I think actually Makovsky, I'll say that this painting he put it on the road. This was a traveling carnival picture. It traveled right across the United States in the 1880s. He copyrighted prints of it. Hillwood has people coming to the museum, and they go into the room where this painting is shown, and they say, my great-grandmother had this in her dining room. And so this painting, this idea of Russianness, belonged to an entire generation of Americans. And I think there's like that germ of the grit in the shell that makes the oyster. I think this is one of the first ways in which we can imagine that Americans came to think about what icons were. So this is the early 1880s. I'm making a big to-do about this, but because otherwise it's impossible to understand how this develops. The second thing that happens, which I only found about relatively recently, shame on me, 1886 was considered in this country the year of Tolstoy. This was the year that his collected works were translated into English, and it was an absolute sensation, because this is when Americans fell in love with the Russian soul, Russkaya dusha, and the whole idea of the deep mystical nature of the Russian people. And through reading Tolstoy, through reading, for example, about the Battle of Borodino, where the Smolensk Mother of God is there at the battlefield, it provided another kind of context for Americans to understand why this thing called the icon is actually a pretty interesting phenomenon. So this kind of, really like a cult of Tolstoy starts in the middle 1880s, and it goes all the way through to us now, actually. And the third thing I wanted to say, this is on a very different level. All of this, I suppose I'm promoting this because it was all new to me at a certain point, and now I think, how did I not know this? So in 1888, this man here on the left, George Kennan, he began delivering huge public lectures right across the United States about his experience going to the penal colonies in Siberia. and exposing the abuses of the Tsarist imperial system. So he had exclusive access. He went into all these Siberian settlements. This on the right is the book that came out of it, 1891, what's it called? Siberian, the Exile System. And this was an absolute shocking revelation, again, to the American population. He spoke to audiences of thousands right across the country. And what I haven't explained is who is this on the left? This is him in his lecture-giving outfit. So he is wearing shackles and garments which were given to him by exiles and prisoners that he had met during his exploratory journeys. And he would get up on stage clanking with his manacles and tell people just how terrible the Russian system was. So here, by the beginning of the 1890s, you've got this really interesting situation where Americans have quite a varied, or at least a layered notion about Russia. You know, black and white, warm and dark, powerful and mystical. And that kind of, I think, is the beginning of the development of this kind of love affair with Russianness, which is possibly why many of us are here today, actually. You know, it doesn't grow overnight. The way a whole nation might develop an interest in something called Russia, and then gradually out of that, in the icon as kind of a phenomenon that represented Russia, at least in the beginning of the 20th century. Okay. And I see this quote here, which is from George Kennan. It's like he was a virulent campaigner. You can just imagine getting up and listening to him, and then going back and thinking, oh, what I wanted to say at the beginning, the first quote I gave you came out of an article that was promoting the icon that he brought back from Siberia for his wife. So there is a really interesting circularity here about contact, first moments of contact. Okay, so now I move radically into the future. So I'm skipping ahead enormously, but I would say from the beginning of the 1900s to the time of the Russian Revolution, not much happens. You know, there is not much in the way of collecting. There's general interest, reading Tolstoy. You might go to a Russian church and see it, but generally there's no real interest in acquiring icons or studying icons. Doesn't go anywhere until the Russian Revolution of 1917. And this is when access suddenly becomes the issue. So you might be interested in thinking about them or looking at a picture, but there's no kind of mechanism for actually acquiring your own icons. So you can't really collect icons up until the Revolution of 1917. And there's the most wonderful parallel to be drawn here, of course, with the French Revolution of 1789. That's when so many Europeans began to collect 18th century French decorative arts and painting, because it was suddenly glutted the market when all those aristocrats lost everything. And the same thing happened after 1917, when the Orthodox Church was essentially shut down by the Bolshevik regime. It opened the floodgates on an enormous pile of icons that were available for anyone wanting to take that. So what I'm going to show you two examples from this sort of chaos period around the Revolution and the Civil War that followed it. This is a man from Pittsford, New York, outside of Rochester. He was a landscape architect. This is remarkable to see here. And here he is in Russia in 1919, because he was one of, I don't know how many, hundreds, I would say, Americans who went to Russia to sort of either see what was going on there, like John Reed, for example, the famous American revolutionary, or in this case, those who wanted to help the dire need of the Russian refugees and just the victims of the revolution and the war. So he went, and he was a photographer employed by the Red Cross to photograph conditions. And in the process, I don't think this was his main thing, but he was able to pick up an icon or two, or maybe three or four. This is the icon that is now in the Rochester Memorial Art Gallery that he brought home with him. It was given by a friend of his to the museum in the 1980s. But the quote that I've got here from Steele himself is this notion of how easy it was to buy something if you knew what you were looking at. You know, so if you had any kind of aesthetic sense, you might go for an icon like this, for example. So this is just like an example of the situation in which icon collecting might occur. And I'll show you another example, which is, I think, one of the most interesting from this period. I'm staging us through historically. So some of you might have gone to the Gardner Museum, the Elizabeth Gardner Museum in Boston, and walked into the tapestry room, and there you would see this Russian icon, which was brought back for Isabella Stewart Gardner by this man at the top here in the Astrakhan hat. This is Thomas Whittemore, who subsequently went on to become the Byzantine scholar who restored Hagia Sophia. He was a hugely important person in Byzantine studies, but at this point he was into refugee work, and he was doing a lot of back and forward between the United States and Russia, bringing food aid under really precarious conditions. He was already a close friend of Isabella Stewart Gardner, the great collector, and she asked him to bring back for him an icon, and this is the one that he brought back. It arrived at Fenway Court, her museum, in 1922, I think. It's a 15th century icon of the Ascension, so from our perspective now, this would be considered one of the most important, the best icons in America. This is certainly how it's been thought of for a long time. But the thing that interests me most about it is Gardner's approach to the icon when she received it. So you don't, this is how it is if you were looking at it in a catalogue, sort of totally cut out of time and space. But this is how it is when you see it in the museum. It's the most interesting thing. So she had, I think she must have designed it herself, a special display stand for the icon so that it reflected her sense of kind of spiritual interest in it as part of her collection. So if you've been through the Gardner Museum, you might remember how many of her works of, especially religious art, but not only religious art, have these whole kind of decorative surrounds made of fabrics and ornaments, and they're in conversation with a whole bunch of other objects. And in this case, she's had an oak frame made for it. These two little silver things at the top, these are French bénitiers, holy water founts that you might have seen if you were Catholic. You might have seen it in a French church. And the most amazing thing at the bottom is this strange scarf, or it's hand-painted silk, and it was made by the brother of the modern dancer Isadora Duncan, so who was himself like a modernist artist in the 1920s. So you've got this incredible pastiche of religious elements, modernist elements, and the thing I think that's most interesting is how Gardner is trying to situate one of the first icons in an American museum within a kind of a sacral, but not necessarily orthodox context. So it's not enough to just hang it on the wall. She's wrapped it in these kind of sacrificial, honorific elements that sort of do honor to the icon from her perspective as a Protestant person. And I think it's one of the only examples I know of, actually, in a museum in this country of how an icon might be displayed in this, with this kind of empathy. If you're Orthodox, you might think this is just totally wrong. But from someone that understands the sacred quality of an icon, this was her effort to kind of integrate it into a larger idea of sacred art without thinking about it as religious history necessarily. So I make a point of this, not just because I think it's really fascinating, and it says something unique about this particular museum. And this is the only icon in the Gardner Museum, the only Russian work of art actually in that museum, and it's definitely the only icon in display in Boston, I would say. So it's or maybe that's changing now, but it just shows how what a special sensibility was needed at this time to find a place for this image in an American collection. So now I'm going to make a really big leap to going back to the Soviet context, like what happens after this period of chaos. I'm sweeping through completely, rushing through the 1920s, where of course there are people going and picking up treasures, picking up icons, but the point I want us to arrive at is the late 1920s, 1928 to be specific, when the Soviet regime inaugurated an official war against religion. The 5-year campaign against religion, they called it. And this involved an ambition to essentially wipe out religion. They gave us 5 years to wipe out religious superstition in the population, and then we could move on. So you imagine how intense the operations were. So these are just sort of obvious images from this. There's lots of them around. So in trying to get the population to voluntarily give up or be forced to give up their personal icons, here, this is a propaganda photo, putting them on a wagon to take them away for burning. I mean, this is meant to really annoy people. This is meant to be, inflammatory. Or this wonderful image, I think, from an atheist alphabet, it's called. It's sort of saying why we need to get rid of all this junk. It's just junk. Sweep it away with the red broom. The icon, the gospel, the censer, the cross, just get rid of it. So, I mean, this is like, I'm showing you these two images to suggest an entire public campaign. And if you think about this, if you're just standing here in 1930 and thinking, so what are the consequences of this? The consequences are another enormous outpouring of unwanted icons for someone that might want to pick them up. And this is my sort of my second, I think I'm doing okay. This is the point where I think it's not just about desire to have an icon or collect icons or be interested in them, it's having opportunity also. And this moment was an enormous opportunity for collectors, for wannabe collectors or museums. And I don't want to say that Americans suddenly became stupendous collectors of icons, they didn't. But this is the period of the mass acquisition of icons, if there was such a thing. Because because isn't going to lead in a good direction. So I've got three threads that I want to thread together that come out of this moment of the late 20s, early 30s, when really the fate of icons hangs in the balance, I would say. You can see that they could easily have just been destroyed. This was a moment of incredible danger for the icon as an object. So I'm going to show you three ways in which they survived, essentially. So the first of them, and this is only now a story which the Russian museum community is willing to talk about because it's kind of shameful for them, is how in the late 20s, there was an intellectual community interested in the salvation of national heritage, who went out on a limb. They really risked life and limb, essentially, to go out to monasteries, go out to churches, take the best, oldest, most important national treasures of icon painting, bring them back to their studio in Moscow and clean them and heal them, essentially. Because otherwise, there's no doubt they would have died. They would have gone. So what I'm showing you here, this is the epicenter of this movement. The bald man standing up behind is a man called Igor Gerba, and he was the mastermind behind a movement to restore icons and move them safely from the church, where they were no longer going to be safe, obviously, to the safety of the museum. This is an absolutely quintessential moment of the museification of icons. And he did it through what was called the scientific method of restoration. So no cult, no mumbo-jumbo, no superstition. This is all about hard science of how to clean icons properly and turning them into works of art. And under those categories, icons survived throughout the Soviet period. And I'm showing you on the right, I'm sorry it's not in color, but it's still pretty fabulous. This is an icon from iconostasis, which was made by Andrew Rublev, or at least by his team, team. And it's being shown in the process of restoration. And these funny strips that you can see here are the layers and layers of dirt and later painting which have been stripped away on its way back to being the original Andrei Rublev icon. So this was the whole mystique and majesty of what they were doing. They were saying, look at all these layers of time. We're going to take them away, the imperial period, the Muscovite period, and we're going to come back to the beautiful early 1400s when everything was fabulous. And all that after history, we're going to get rid of it and just have the pure icon left. So this led to these are really boring images, but conceptually they're incredibly interesting, because between 1929 and 1932, these workshops, these restorers, were able to put together a huge traveling exhibition of these cleaned icons. They went to Germany, they went to Austria, they went to London, and they ended up in the United States. And for 18 months, they toured, starting in Boston, ending in Cincinnati. They traveled, and at a certain point, they spent the winter in St. Paul, where they really suffered badly. So they came through this part of town in the winter of 1930. And this was Americans' first complete revelatory experience of icons as we maybe now think of as masterpieces of art. You know, they showed the best things, they showed things that had been cleaned, they showed things in the process of being cleaned. What's my next image? This is just kind of a bolt out of the blue, but for example, when the exhibition stopped in Cincinnati, this is a really interesting moment because the year before, the museum had just bought this crucifixion by El Greco. And it's not really said anywhere, but the idea that in this same museum, there could be Russian icons, and then this image by an artist who had started out as an icon painter, El Greco, the Greek, is kind of interesting. You know, that this was a moment where Americans were really getting exposed to world art. You know, these exhibitions were showing all kinds of things to the American public, among which were icons. And I'll show you, this is not, again, a very good image, but this is from the Cincinnati newspaper, just showing this very distinguished, sober image of St. Nicholas here with a caricature by Picasso and some artists I've never even heard of. That this is what was going around in the museums in 1932, and one of which was an icon. So it's a moment where Americans saw a lot of icons, and they loved them, and they were fascinated by them. It was a moment where it was all going to take off. You know, oh my gosh, we finally discovered them. And actually that didn't happen, I must say. I'll tell you why in a minute. So another thread I'm just going to show you this very briefly because it's fascinating to me, but maybe not so much to you. But if any of you were lucky or unlucky enough to go to the Soviet Union before 1991, you would have almost certainly gone through Intourist, the official state tourist agency. Intourist was set up, it was invented in 1928 to encourage foreign tourists to come to the Soviet Union, shed their hard-earned dollars and see how wonderful the Soviet experiment was, while also spending as much hard currency as possible. And what I'm showing here is this marvelous painting from 1937 of foreign tourists being shown the sights of Leningrad. Just, you know, this was totally seeing things the way we want you to see them. And the point I want to make, I mean, this is thousands of American tourists came to the Soviet Union in the late 20s into the 1930s before the war. And they were encouraged, as we were all encouraged actually in the late Soviet period. They would do you remember, if you ever did this, you might remember the buses when you're on a bus tour and you're taken to the souvenir shop where you're expected to buy all kinds of stuff to take home for hard currency. And they invented this in the early 1930s. So these are two of the stop-off places where American tourists or any tourists were taken. So this is Mostorg, the Moscow trading store. On the right, this is Torksing, as short for the Trading with Foreigners store. And they were specifically there to tempt foreigners to buy stuff that they could take home, because you weren't allowed to take your money out again. So you either did or you just lost it. And this on the left here, this wonderful photo by a travel writer called Branson Decoux. His entire photo archive of his trip to the Soviet Union in the early 30s is now in the Santa Cruz University archives. You can find it online. It's the most amazing record of this moment. So here he is with his wife, madly snapping photos of the local flora and fauna. Oh my gosh, look at all these Soviet citizens. And they're parked outside the Mostorg store. And almost certainly they've gone in there and they will have visited the art and antiques department, and almost certainly they would have bought an icon. And this is just the point. This is too big for me really to get into now, but I think there are dozens of homes and attics and drawers across this country that have got an icon that was maybe bought on one of these trips from one of these stores. in the 1930s. So these are just two. These are things that have come up at auction. You know where they come from because they've got a label on the back, a shopping label that tells you where they're from, the Mastorg label here. This is like another layer, like a next layer down of kind of availability and supply and demand. So the last thing, I think, I wanted to show you was the thing. This is the most sensationalist thing I have to tell you, but I think just because it's, you know, kind of sleazy, it doesn't mean I can't tell you about it. And you may already know about this already because it's kind of a legend. Arm & Hammer is a legend of American entrepreneurship, as you may know. He belongs to us all, for better or worse. So Arm & Hammer and his brother Victor spent the 1920s in the Soviet Union doing deals and doing commissions and, you know, finding ways to make money with the Soviets. And they came back with an enormous amount of stuff which they called the Russian imperial treasures. This was, I mean, just anything that they could get. A lot of it came from the palaces of the former imperial palace, imperial family, and they had a whole kind of merchandising shtick that went on with it, one of which I'm showing you a label from one of the exhibitions. So one of the first ways they tried to sell their merchandise to the American public was through department stores, which is not, it sounds kind of crazy now, but it was actually a normal thing in the 30s for big department stores in the United States to have art and antiques departments. We could go and you could buy art and antiques. And this is what they did. They made agreements with 27 American antique stores, department stores, and they had a stand, and they had labels with double-headed eagles on them to show that this was imperial stuff, with descriptions. This is a description of an icon, and every icon came from the family, the murdered family of Nicholas and Alexandra. This was kind of what they said. And this statement here on the top, which I think is deliberately provocative on Hammer's part, this is what he said later in life, that he's actually coming up with a whole new way of democratizing art, making art a commodity like any other commodity. But this idea of what would make people buy these things is what is so fascinating about this last episode, I'm going to tell you. So here is Arm & Hammer looking very suave in his double-breasted suit, taking tea. This is at the Foreman's department store in Rochester, New York. And behind him on the wall, you can see some of the icons in their collection. And he's taking tea out of a Sèvres tea set that once belonged to the Empress. So, you know, this is like, this too could be yours, is really the message here. So what he and his brother, actually his brother Victor was the brains behind this, because he took an art history degree from Princeton, so he was quite knowledgeable about art. And it was Victor that went over to the Soviet Union with an associate of his, Alexander Schaefer, a young Hungarian refugee. And together they were given exclusive entree to the apartments of the imperial family, and they could pick stuff to bring back to sell on the American market. And as far as I know, no one else, no other dealer from Europe was given this particular privilege, because the Soviet trade agents felt that only Americans would buy this stuff. And it's a cruel truth, but it turned out to be a truth. So this on the right, a really moving watercolor that was made by a Soviet artist around 1931 of the icon cabinet in the bedroom of the Tsarevich, Alexei. And what I find, so there are also photographs of this space, but what's amazing about this, you can already see the empty spaces where the icons have been taken off. And this icon here of Saint Panteleimon, the healing saint, is from one of these spaces. You can actually see in the photographs that he came from one of the spaces in this wall. And this is now in the Virginia Museum of Fine Art. It was sold by Hammer to Lillian Pratt, an American collector in the 30s. So there's all these kind of threads tying things up together again. Now, in terms of motivation, I think this, if we thought back to Tolstoy and George Kennan and what motivated people in the 30s, there's no doubt that in the 1930s, what motivated American potential customers was their absolute obsession with the tragedy of the Romanov family. So again, there's so many things I've only found out relatively recently. So between 1929 and 1930, there was not one but two movies on Rasputin. that you could go and see in America. So this is one with the 3 Barrymores. One of the Barrymores played Rasputin. Just so extraordinary. This wonderful still on the right here of the boy playing the Tsarevich, and just over to the right here, here's Rasputin's horrible hand, and behind it is an icon that they've put in there as part of the window dressing of the movie. Can you just barely see it there? It's got a nice jeweled cover on it. And at the same time, there were lots of books that you could read about. This one on the left is by Gleb Botkin, who was the emperor's doctor. On the right, this is by one of the ladies in waiting to the empress. And this whole, the aura, the empathy, that owning something that belonged to this tragic family, it was the number one commercial drawer that the Hammers used to sell things out of their Russian exhibits. And so this icon here, which came up at auction actually just a couple of years ago, came with the label, the Hammer label, the Hammer testimonial, and a 3-page letter by the woman who had bought the icon for the man that it owned to. And in that letter, you can go and see it online, it's the most extraordinary thing. It says, the woman who sold this to me at Lord & Taylor in New York in 1932, she told me all about how this had been given by a peasant family to the empress, and how tragic this was because the Tsarevich was dying. And then in there she says, have you read Rasputin the Sinner? I think you'll like the icon. So this connection between that has no real bearing on the imperial family except by hearsay, is instantly wrapped for that customer in the aura of the imperial tragedy on the basis of the story that was told to them by Hammer's shop assistant. So I know I'm sounding kind of very sleazy about this, I know. But I think it's important because it really has established a lot of the expectations and the mental equipment with which generations of Americans have looked at icons. I think I've got 1 or 2 more. So this is, again, from the newspaper showing the exhibition as it passes through Rochester. And on the table on the bottom left here, this little triptych is this one on the left here that was given to the imperial couple at their wedding in 1894. There's like a whole, to go back from that very first icon I showed you to this one and sort of feel the unfolding or the unwrapping of interest from bare disdain, really, like vague curiosity, to this absolutely voracious fascination with the things that once belonged to the imperial family. I think for me, this is the first chapter of collecting in America, Russians looking at icons in America. And after that, after the war, there's another story. After 1991, there's yet another story where Ilya's family's icons come in that moment. So I think that there's like an archaeology for us to think about in terms of where collections come from, why people collect what they do, why they end up in museums like Constanze's. I will finish there. Thank you so much.
As an American, how did your interest in icons start?
Mine? Well, actually, I'm not an American.
Oh.
No. But I'm an honorary American, I suppose. I'm a New Zealander, so it's even a better question because there's no earthly reason why I should have done this. I'll tell you what, I was trained as a modernist secular art historian of Russian art, and I'd never seen an icon I was interested in until 1994, and I had a year as a guest curator at Hillwood Museum in Washington. And the job they gave me was to research their icon collection, which had never been looked at before. And that's the first time I looked at an icon in person, where I turned it over and looked at the back, and I looked at all 100 icons, and I sort of teach yourself icons, that's what it was. And then only gradually did I learn to have the feelings about them I do know. That for me it was a hard sell. You know, it wasn't instant love at all. It was a kind of, God, these things are incredibly interesting and incredibly difficult because they're not all the same. That's what, it's the unbelievable variety of them is one of the first things you know, like it's a whole school of painting. It's, you know, so that's that's what I would say. And then, 35 years later, I'm still at it.
Just, if I may, I can also, it's fun that even if I'm not American, as you know, but I'm just in the field for 5 years now. I'm a comparative scholar I'm a scholar in comparative religion, so I come from the field of religious objects in museums, and also worked about these anti-religious religious objects in anti-religious museums in the Soviet Union, so where you're showing these wonderful anti-religious posters. But I must say, it also for me, it was not first, love at first sight, definitely not. But the longer I am working in the museum, and the longer I'm in contact with icons and with the people in front of icons, and behind icons and next to icons, it's getting more and more fascinating, I must say, because the more you learn, and also me, I'm very interested in the inscriptions, because I also was doing some stuff with Ethiopia and with Greece and with Russian icons, so I can read these inscriptions, and this is like your Sherlock Holmes, and you really try to find out what is written on these icons, and it's a sort of puzzle or detective play or game or even movie. So the more you learn about icons, this is my personal view, the more interesting they get. And for this we need people like maybe us and Simon and other people in this audience who came for this talk, who also translate the icons to the people. That's why I think also contextualization is very, very important, because icons, they would not reveal themselves just by putting them on a wonderful painted wall and being displayed in nice light. So you need the stories behind them, and most people, when they stay in front of an icon, they don't know it's Sergei or Radomir, or maybe they know Saint Nicholas, but they would not know who all these figures are and why they are painted exactly in this fashion. And also that there's this development in icons, so it's, even if they use these old techniques, they look so different. Mary looks so different in Ethiopia, and she looks so different on a silver tin foil icon from northern Russia, and even she looks different on a Bulgarian icon. I think this is what makes it to me so interesting. The more you are studying icons and learn about the stories they reveal, and someone helps you to discover these stories, the more interesting it gets, at least for me, and I hope also for the visitors in our museums.
I think it would be good, unless there's more questions, if either one or both of you could give some little perspectives or insights into the Kushnirskiy Collection. Like if there's something that people, because this is a really unique collection of icons, and being that Lilia is here as well, if there's anything you want to point people towards or to look toward this particular collection.
I think it's a really wonderful starter. It's not the most obvious collection to start with, like educating what you just looking, but precisely because the subjects are so repetitious, and yet everyone is slightly different from the other. It's actually an exercise in slowing down, which we don't have much time. So you have to have time to look at it. You can't just push through. But even just choosing a couple of icons of the Descent into Hell and seeing how different from each other they are. There are 3 or 4 centuries up there. And when you start thinking, boy, here's the same looking thing, but this one is from the 17th century and this is from the 19th century, how can that be? And then the more you look, you can actually see, there are these changes in there, but you have to engage yourself. You have to participate, I think.
Yeah, there's not much I could supplement, but you have only rarely the occasion to see icons so refined and with such a detail and in such an amazing state of conservation. So this is what impressed me a lot when I first saw them 2 hours ago. So this is such a rare opportunity, and also what I would call the closeness, or this is collected with such an expertise, so you rarely find this. Even in icon museums you have a broader variety, but here you can really compare these very detailed, very fine mastery of the masters at various icon workshops like Paarlechens, etc. So this is unique, and we should really take this opportunity to enjoy these very, very fine and very detailed, sacred masterpieces.
Anyone else have any questions before we let you go tonight? Well, with that, let's give a big round of applause for Dr. Weaver and Dr. Salmond. Thank you, Ilya, for all of your work bringing all this together. Feel free, if you want to take a look upstairs, we'll let you have some more time in the museum. Thank you for coming out tonight. We'll see you again soon.